Hello and welcome to a Conquest, the Last Argument of Kings event list analysis video. Today we're going to be looking at the top 3 lists that were played at CanCon 2025 in reverse order: Dweghom, City-States, and Nords. We're going to be using this as an opportunity to look at different list concepts, things that you want to build into a force in Conquest, and how each of these different lists approach those challenges and maybe focuses on different elements in a list, and how each of the list plays and obviously performed as a result. Now, one interesting slash thing to note is that there's no 100 Kingdoms players in the podium, but there were 100 Kingdoms players at both 4th and 5th place. A fairly good outcome and kind of to be expected given that 100 Kingdoms recently had a rework. We're not going to be looking at those lists for two reasons. Firstly, just for brevity, otherwise the video would be too long. But the main reason is that when CanCon was held, firstly, the update had only just dropped. The 100 Kingdoms rework had arrived maybe 2 weeks previous. And so both players' lists are relatively constrained by what they could get painted, since CanCon was a fully painted required event. But secondly, a significant portion of the models available even now for 100 Kingdoms, the Theist releases that have come out recently, weren't legal at time of CanCon. It might theoretically have been possible for one or both players to get their hands on, for example, an Archangel and a Crusading Noble Lord, and get them painted in time if Parabellum had broken their own street date and shipped things out early, but the models would not be legal. And so, although there was a pretty cool Imperial Theist Feudal list, so that would be Theist Feudal with an Imperial splash, and an all cavalry, I believe, feudal orders list. Those lists ultimately represent things that were built for the time, and there are just already new models available that can inform list construction for 100 Kingdoms. So, we're going to be looking at Dweghom, City-States, and Nords, starting with 3rd place, Tom Nash with Dweghom. Now, given that CanCon is an Australian event, in this particular case, I'm actually privileged enough to be able to regularly play against all 3 players who made it to the podium at CanCon, and so I can speak both to their lists but also to the players with perhaps a little bit more detail than I would if I was looking at an American tournament result, for example. And I can very happily say that all 3 players, including Tom, are extraordinarily skilled, well-rounded, and competent Conquest players. In Tom's case, we're playing a Dweghom list with a lot of dragons. We'll go through all of the pieces in it, but then we'll talk about what it means in terms of how you can approach formation building and force concentration in Conquest. So, what's in Tom's list? The first warband is a hold reg. He has no upgrades, and he just joins a regular unit of warriors. We then have a second regular unit of warriors, and those are there as the cheapest possible effective mainstays to unlock a pair of Ironclad Drakes. Ironclad Drakes are probably the most well-rounded monster in Conquest. There are more durable monsters, there are more expensive and kind of more dangerous monsters. But Ironclad Drakes hit the sweet spot of just a little bit of army buffing, but they are fast, and they have really nice offensive stats. They have spike potential thanks to relentless blows, but they will still put out a fairly consistent number of hits, and because those hits have brutal impact on the charge, cleave 2, and terror 2, it's just really reliable for Ironclad Drakes to push through a lot of damage against basically whatever they hit, unless the unit's defenses are really high and or include things like Fearless to help mitigate the terror. We then have a Tempered Sorcerer Warlord. Magma School, there will be a second Tempered Sorcerer also running Magma. If you're familiar with Dweghom Tempered Creed in general, but the Tempered Sorcerers in particular, you'll know that a Magma Sorcerer Warlord and a second Magma Sorcerer play well kind of just together. The Tempered Sorcerer Warlord, having 2 spells, can both create Magma Terrain using 1 spell, and then use that spell to increase the range of his other offensive spells, and then the second Tempered Sorcerer can do the same thing. So you can use one Tempered Sorcerer and then the second in conjunction to put out actually a fair bit of damage, despite the fact that Pyroclast and, to a lesser extent, Eruption, but in particular Pyroclast, is not the most dangerous offensive spell in the game. It's quite consistent, and being able to put 2 of them out can put quite a lot of pressure on your opponent. We then have a unit of Fireforged and a unit of Hold Ballistae. The Hold Ballistae have a Herald of Magma, so this further plays into some synergy with the Magma Sorcerers. What that Herald of Magma can do is the Hold Ballistae can sit in a unit of terrain. They turn, in addition to just having Aura of Death, they will turn that piece of terrain into erupting terrain, which also allows the Tempered Sorcerer's spells, in particular Pyroclast, to play off of that terrain, which further extends your range. That's going to be really important when we talk about force concentration in this list, because one of the things this list does is force concentrate really, really well. It can put a lot of force in a small spot. When you do that, you still want to be able to project force elsewhere on the table, and those hold ballistae will just from time to time enable the Dweghom player running this combination to have the hold ballistae away from the main force of the army, but still have that ballista unit present quite a lot of danger, not just because of their own crossbow bolts, but because of the fact that any terrain they're sitting in can become a sudden and violent source of fiery death for the opponent. We then have the Hellbringer Drake, which the Tempered Sorcerer is riding. We then have the third and final warband, which consists of a second Tempered Sorcerer Magma, riding a Hellbringer Drake with a unit of Fireforged as a mainstay. So if we look at the list in total, firstly, this gives us a reasonably healthy activation count of 12 activations. 12 is on the higher side of normal. It's enough to be able to just do a reasonable variety of things, but we also have a fairly clean reinforcement curve with this list. We have a single light regiment that can be ordered onto the field on the first turn, then a depth of mediums, some of which you will want to arrive early, but some of which you can comfortably have arrive a little bit later. One of the unit of Hold Warriors can comfortably arrive late. Some of the Fireforged can comfortably arrive late, for example, which means that you get a reasonably nice reinforcement curve where you'll have a lot of medium dice. You'll get your pick, usually bringing on, if you can, 2 drakes as your first 2 mediums, and then ideally something to shield those drakes potentially, and then 2 heavies. Now, 2 heavies means that this list will often be entirely on the board by no later than turn 4. You'll auto on the first Ironclad Drake on turn 3, and then if the second doesn't arrive on turn 4, you'll auto in on as well. All of your mediums will also arrive then. That's what we would generally consider to be gets fast enough. You can have lists that run multiple heavies and arrive quite late to the battlefield, but the risk of that is that you'll have too much of your force off the field too much of the game. And especially if a heavy regiment doesn't arrive until turn 5, then maneuver on turn 6, contribute to the battle on turn 6 or turn 7, that can really have you feel like you're playing down maybe just slightly more than you want to. Those kind of lists can work, but you have to play them quite carefully. This list, with 2 heavies, lots of mediums, and 1 light, will arrive in a nice consistent way, which enables a couple of things. Firstly, it enables practiced formation construction, and then that formation construction in turn creates force concentration. So we're going to use this list to talk about force concentration. What does that mean? So in basically any war game, but especially in rank and flanks, right? Games where maneuver is constrained, the ability to concentrate force is really significant. It means, in essence, putting more of your stuff, more of your power, in a smaller place than your opponent can, and then fighting across that narrower frontage. If you think about something like an Ironclad Drake, for example, it projects a lot of danger off of a frontage that is narrower than a 3-wide unit. This means that Tom can build a list that packs together across a relatively narrow frontage because you've got maybe a row of Fireforged and Hold Warriors with Ironclad Drakes interspersed between, and then Hellbringer Drakes with the Sorcerers on behind them. This entire list can build a formation that is relatively mobile, can kind of move past itself if you're doing things carefully and correctly, but nevertheless projects a wall of melee threat and firepower that can just project an existential threat into any kind of a wider list that does not necessarily have the ability to compact itself into the same frontage Tom is fighting across. Now, that does mean that a list that is built to be compact like this, obviously it's not spreading out across the entire table, it's not necessarily scoring all possible scenario zones, which does mean that yes, in some scenarios, you can fall behind on points early, for example, or you can be forced into a position where you have to just maintain parity. But the thing about concentration of force is that fundamentally it destroys armies. If we think back to like any kind of classic battlefield, there are just not many tactics as ancient and classic as bringing a large portion of your force to bear on a smaller portion of your opponent, defeating it with relatively few casualties, and then moving on to continue to do that, doing what is called defeat in detail of your opponent. Concentration of force allows defeat in detail, and this list is really good at concentrating force, which means it's very good at eventually destroying the entirety of an opponent's army. The guns and the melee power of the Ironclad Drakes allow it to just deliver hammer blows to parts of the table where the force are concentrated. Also, I've mentioned here talking about fighting in formation. That's another thing that Dweghom generally wanted to do, and this list does really well. One of the really nice things about Hellbringer Drakes, and to an extent having Sorcerers on top, is that a Hellbringer Drake is a size 3 gun, and all of the rest of this list apart from the Ironclads are size 1, which means that the Hellbringer Drakes have basically unrestricted field of fire to anything in the entire enemy army, because they can obviously see over size 1 and size 2, and obviously 2 size 3. Which lets them shoot whatever they want, despite the fact that they'll be sitting behind a row of Fireforged or Hold Warriors. And unless you have ranged models of your own that can compete in terms of firepower with two Hellbringer Drakes with Sorcerers on the back, it can be very challenging to oppose that. Now, some factions will have things that can deal with that. One of the things that the Hellbringers don't particularly like is if they are significantly outranged. Stuff like Marksman clones and Longbowmen have a long range advantage over the 16-inch effective range of all of the guns and the spells on the Hellbringers and the Sorcerers, which can put the Hellbringers in kind of an awkward situation where they either have to choose to just weather that firepower or potentially move out of the box or unfold the formation a little bit to grapple with the aggressors. And frankly, what will usually happen is that in the tokens that are being generated by the Tempered Sorcerers will just be used to weather that firepower, but that means that those tokens aren't being used to help the front line, which will usually be durable, but not overwhelmingly durable, right? Things like the Warriors, they're tough enough. The Fireforged certainly are tough, but there's a big difference between Warriors with tokens available and Fireforged with tokens available and Hellbringers with tokens available and without. And so if you have things like good long-ranged pressure, you can stress the token generation of the Dweghom a little bit, and you otherwise deal with this list by trying to deny it the strength that it's trying to build. If you do not give it the opportunity to bring that concentrated force to bear, you stay away from the Hellbringer guns, for example, you build your own forces elsewhere, you occupy other scenario points elsewhere, and especially if you're able to get a lead on scenario, not just parity, but get ahead on scenario while refusing a flank, that can force a list like this to split its force concentration. And while individual Ironclad Drakes rampaging around are still very, very scary, if they're isolated, they can be picked off. They'll often kill something on the way down, but you can put one unit in front of an Ironclad Drake. Yes, that unit will probably die, but if you collapse on the Ironclad Drake, you can then kill it. They are fairly durable, but they only become truly difficult to kill when there are Dweghom Sorcerers nearby to give them the benefit of those tempered tokens. Overall, though, this is basically just a par excellence Dweghom list. You could theoretically move it more toward kind of like a stable median by, yes, cutting one Ironclad Drake. If you cut one Ironclad Drake, that lets you turn one of the units of Hold Warriors into a larger unit of Initiates, which you can then give the Hold Reg. You can put him in the Initiates, you can give him some offensive upgrades. You get a nice sort of stable regiment out of that that's very good at holding a point. You use maybe some other spare points elsewhere, perhaps to bulk out the Tempered Sorcerer regiment, something like that. But of course, making that change, well, for one thing, it fundamentally changes the list, but it also gives up one of the fundamental cool factors about the list, which is that it has 4 dragons. 4 dragons is extremely cool and looks awesome and therefore makes this list awesome. And I've got absolutely no doubt that it was piloted excellently by Tom, as evidenced by his third place finish at CanCon amidst a very competitive overall crowd. So congratulations, Tom, on third place at CanCon. A great placement with a great and really dangerous and aggressive and concentrated Dweghom list. Up next, we have City States, piloted by Michael Martin, another Canberra local. You might have seen pictures of this list. It's wonderful green and gold and white. And as we look at this list, we're going to use it as a little bit of an example of talking about a couple of things. Firstly is building in technology and capability, the ability to do different things into a list, but also just the benefits of practice, because this is a list that Michael practiced for some time and then was significantly changed by an update that was released not long before the event. Michael elected to more or less keep the list as it was. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think that is and why I think it was a good idea, as evidenced by the fact that he came second out of 30 players. So this list is led by an Aristarch Warlord. Michael is a long-time Aristarch Warlord enjoyer, and although I believe there's been like a little bit of tinkering with the city-states Warlords over the course of sort of recent history, and in particular just prior to the CanCon update, I believe was when one of the things about the Aristarch changed, his infantry tactics supremacy ability now only applies to infantry and brutes, whereas previously it worked on monsters, and we're going to see some of those in this list. Michael is still a big Aristarch enjoyer and elected to keep the Aristarch as his warlord, and I think that's perfectly sensible. So the Aristarch has the Inscription of Impact Resistance, which gives him as a draw event the ability to grant Tenacious 1 to his regiment. Now, in some cases that would be very awkward, right? You'd rather just pay 25 points for an item that many other factions have, where they just give Tenacious 1 to a regiment. But in the case of the Aristarch, because of his battlefield orders, he's often going to just be activating early in the turn anyway to give other defensive buffs, so it's not that much of a big deal. So we have Tenacious being given by the Inscription of Impact Resistance, and then we'll usually have one of his battlefield orders typically giving Untouchable, which is a nice layered defensive buff, which is going to be given to those Phalangites. He's also got the Initiative Mastery. For my money, this is possibly the most powerful mastery in the game if you are built around it. If you're not, it's very, very good. If you are, out of sequence movement that can then be capitalized on is phenomenally powerful. Now, it comes with strings attached, right? Initiative only triggers after the Aristarch's regiment comes off the strat stack, which significantly dictates your order of your turn. You can't do it early in the turn, but it gives an out of sequence maneuver or reform, and there are units in this list that are fast enough to just get flung across the board by that. Now, to fully maximize initiative, you need a list with a large activation count. Typically something like at least 13 activations, which is very possible for city-states to reach, but you will thin out some of your strengths trying to do that. If you build entirely toward initiative, you can get a list that just fires missiles at your opponent, which they don't necessarily have the ability to respond to, but which compromises itself in other ways. So overall, this list is built just to make good use of initiative. If nothing else, it is pseudo Vanguard for the Aristarch's unit. If they come off the strat stack, they can move onto the field, they get the benefit of infantry tactic speed, and then they can move again with initiative, which lets them get really far up the table if they want to. And because Phalangites are a very solid defensive unit, particularly with the Aristarch's abilities, this just presents a nice anchor for the list. So we have the Aristarch in a unit of Phalangites, 6 stands with the Doralates and the Sacred Band veterans. There's going to be a unit of Sacred Band in this list, which can then play onto the Sacred Band veterans, casting their spells, but Phalangites are just a really nice, well-rounded regiment. They're a touch expensive, but Pike formation is fantastic, Phalanx is fantastic. This list is sitting at like Resolve 7 most of the time, sometimes more. It can be very difficult to push Resolve damage through them, even with Terra. They're going to reliably have access to Inspired, either from the strat stack or from the Doralates, and they put out just an absolute ton of attacks. It is perhaps very slightly less durable. Like, Pike formation is a fantastic rule. It's not necessarily better than the shields you would get on hoplites, but the overall damage output just makes the Phalangites a better, well-rounded regiment in addition to the synergy with Sacred Band. We've then got 2 War Chariots, and I believe 1 Phlogobolan and 1 Scorpios. War Chariots are fantastic, they remain fantastic. The Scorpios, I think, still comes out slightly ahead of the Phlogobolan, but having your second chariot be a Phlogobolan is totally fine. In these situations where a Phlogobolan is better, it is better, a bit of a tautology there, I admit, but there are certain things that the Phlogobolan can do. It can operate in close support of a heavily engaged unit. It's a little bit better at killing objectives because its effective range is so long, and it's a bit more dangerous when it's in effective range, that you can have one of your chariots be a Phlogobolan and not suffer, and in fact come out ahead because you can angle that chariot into the situations where the Phlogobolan is better. Scorpios probably better in a vacuum. Second chariot being a Phlogobolan makes sense. In our second warband, then, we have a Promethean Oracle with Spear. The Spear gives Unyielding, but in practice the weapons on the Promethean don't matter because neither of them really does anything. And the Promethean's warband includes a Promethean and a Hephaestian. So we have the Promethean Oracle, Promethean, and Hephaestian. Now, it's in the Promethean Oracle that we see one of the things we wanted to talk about, which is really just the benefit of practice in a list. Just before CanCon, the update that dropped that included the 100 Kingdoms rework also included a few small changes to other factions, and one of those changes was that the Jotnar Cedar and Promethean Oracle, which are 2 sides of the same coin, went from medium to heavy. Now, they went down by 20 points, but that is a massive change to how a list plays. And it meant this list went from 2 heavies, which you'll recall we talked about with Tom's Dweghom list. 2 heavies means your whole army will still basically always be on the field by turn 4. The absolute worst case scenario is that the last of your mediums arrive automatically that turn, and you can auto on your last heavy that turn, if you have 2 heavies. If you have 3 heavies, you can be in a situation where your army is not entirely on the field until turn 5. And so the shift in weight, even with the points reduction, the shift in weight to the Promethean Oracle made a really significant difference to how this list might play. Now, you still have decent chances of being entirely on the board by turn 4, right? Because you're rolling all of those heavy reinforcement dice. On turn 3, you have a better than 50% chance to have 2 heavies turn up if you auto 1 on, because you've got those 2 dice each looking for a 1 or a 2 for your other 2 heavies. And then again on turn 4, you've got a good chance, or like a 66% chance of your final heavy arriving just by virtue of rolling a 4 or less on the reinforcement d6. But it does still mean that there is that chance, if all of those possible success opportunities fail, that your army isn't on the field until turn 5. Now, this list can work with that. There are times when the Hephaestion can arrive at a pivotal point. Because it's a monster, it can really turn on a dime. It's fast thanks to the combination of good speed and a narrow frontage, making it wheel quite agilely. Or the Sacred Band can potentially arrive, use infantry tactics for a bit of extra speed if you don't need initiative that turn, or benefit from initiative to be given pseudo Vanguard. And because Sacred Band have a free additional spellcasting action, they can march onto the battlefield, cast a spell on one of the other regiments that has a Sacred Band auxiliary, and that way impact the battlefield on the turn they arrive, even if that turn is late. It's still a change to how the list played. Now, the 20 extra points that the Oracle came down in cost afforded us an upgrade we'll see in the next warband, but this is something that impacts how a list plays not long before the event. Michael would have been given the choice here as to whether or not he should change the list, or should he just play it as is, and he's elected to play it as is. He got all the way to the top table and only lost to the person who came first, which is an excellent overall outcome, and that decision will have been predicated, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but basically on respect for the practice and experience that he had accumulated. Conquest is a really complicated game. And decisions in particular around force allocation, right, where you line your different regiments up with the different things that your opponent can do, trying to arrange certain matchups, trying to think in advance about where your opponent will deploy things, respond when they do, all of that forms the sort of strategic nucleus, the foresight you have to exercise to achieve victory in Conquest. And while, yes, the Oracle changed in weight class, Michael had put a lot of reps into this exact list. And so the overall appraisal was he was better served accepting that, yes, how his list might arrive had changed, but he still understood really well the capabilities of every individual unit, than trying to rebuild the list entirely and give up on that experience. And I think we can see, literally in practice, that that decision to rely on the experience he'd accumulated served him really well in an event. Any complicated war game, right, whether it is Conquest or Infinity or something else, puts a huge mental load on us, and you cannot approach a 5-round event expecting to just from first principles solve every problem put in front of you. You have to shepherd your mental energy really, really carefully, and that means that experience is hugely impactful over a 5-round event, even a 3-round event. And so by basically taking the decision to not change his list, despite the fact that it had been, I'm not going to say nerfed, because a point reduction is still a point reduction, but to not rework his list and preserve his experience, in particular his understanding of how different units could be best employed into different situations, which is very much how Michael tends to play. He's very good at coming up with technology, for want of a better word, where and how to deploy his units to solve certain problems. Overall, his results, I think, were improved by that decision, which we can see. He got all the way to top table, came second out of 30 players. Now, pause for breath. The third regiment is a Polemarch regiment. So we have 3 characters in this list. Polemarch it's the Polemarch. In this particular case, it's a Polemarch with the Arista and Blades of Echides and Combined Arms Drill, which makes this guy really expensive. Blades of Echides, otherwise known as the Lightsaber, means that this guy has Gash 4 with 5 attacks and Cleave 4, which means despite the low attack count, low-ish, 5 is still good, he is an absolute blender. He's going to very reliably put 5 hits with Cleave 4 into something, and Cleave 4 is a lot of Cleave. Now, the Combined Arms Drill Mastery is perhaps a little bit of a vanity pick here. Combined Arms Drill is not hugely expensive, and it allows your auxiliary stands to count as extra stands for the purposes of scoring. The main benefit of that is that it means that the Minotaur Therian in the Thorakides unit that is in the Polemarch's Warband is going to count as +1 stand, which means that it will enable that light regiment to score. Now, for my money, with the other pieces that you have in this list, list, you've got effectively Vanguard on the Aristarch's regiment. You have the ability to get aggressively onto zones in most scenarios on turn 2 if you need to. Turn 2 scoring is just a nice thing to have in any given list because scenarios tend to go live on turn 2 with just one exception, obviously. Maelstrom you can score earlier, but everything else you start scoring from turn 2, so being able to score on turn 2 is significant. One of the ways you can score on turn 2 is with a light regiment that score, the other is with mediums that can get onto the field quickly. And with the Thorakides being able to set a fairly aggressive reinforcement line thanks to Vanguard 3, infantry tactics and good speed, although no, infantry tactics is an always active ability, which means it's active even if the Aristarch isn't on the battlefield. So you can get those Thorakides a long way up on the first turn, and you can use that to do things like set a reinforcement line for your chariots in certain scenarios. You can then use initiative on the Phalangides to get them a long way forward, and so you should be able to score fairly aggressively with this list on turn 2 if you want to, without combined arms drills. But it does let the Thorakides regiment score, and of course it makes the other regiments with Sacred Bands score as well, a little bit more. It's not nothing, it's not necessarily worth 30 points, but before the change to how the Promethean Oracle worked, those were the last 30 points in the list. I think if you were to reapproach this list from first principles, you might consider cutting combined arms drills and the Arista, and maybe even downgrading the Blades of Achates to the other spear that the Polemarch can take, and think about what those points in particular can give you, because it might be significant. But in this case, combined arms drills makes sense as an option to have in some scenarios. Now, the Arista is on the Polemarch because it's 20 points, and this list had 20 points available all of a sudden with the change to the Promethean Oracle. Arista is still a really nice ability. It lets the Polemarch set the charge distance of any other unit nearby to a flat plus 5 inches over their speed, which is a really long distance, and that's an especially long distance when you combine it with things like fluid formation on the Thorakides. But even just letting all of the giants charge a fixed 12 inches, most regiments can't easily kite away from a 12-inch threat, and with the Thorakides that threat gets really long. So we then have the Polemarch obviously in a unit of Thorakides. This is just Thorakides with Aetherian, which means this is not a durable regiment. Like, yes, the Therian has 6 wounds, which means the regiment in total has 18 effective wounds. The resolve is fairly good because of the Polemarch. You have the Polemarch's battlefield orders to maybe do something. Mostly what this regiment does is just hit like a truck. It's got an Andromarchos and the Therian and the Polemarch with the lightsaber. The job of this unit is to, yes, be expensive, but it is to get a pick at some point in the early game that is pivotal to how the game develops. There are lots of regiments in Conquest that are more valuable necessarily than their points cost might indicate. Something like, for example, if a Drake, a Hellbringer Drake with a Sorcerer Warlord on it, arrives on the battlefield early, but maybe there are mediocre reinforcement rolls for the rest of the Dweghom list, and the screens for that Drake don't arrive. This is the kind of unit that beelines toward that Drake and will sacrifice themselves to kill it. Because even though they are more expensive than that Drake Warlord, the value of that Drake Warlord in the context of how the army plays is higher than its points cost would necessarily indicate. And so making that sacrifice to get that pick is a really big deal. I've had this regiment do things like dive a unit of mercenary crossbows with a water mage in them, because even though the unit of mercenary crossbows with a water mage in them is like less than 200 points, which is less even than the Thorakides, that water mage is going to mint value over the course of the game. It's going to mint much more than the 190 points that the regiment costs. And so getting that kill early makes a really big deal. Now, sometimes this regiment will survive, and when it does, it's an unholy terror because it's got fluid formation, it can move around, sometimes it can get a kill and retreat, but most of what this list does is serve as a one-way missile. It'll try and score a zone on turn 2 if it needs to, but otherwise it is going for whatever the most valuable thing it can find is that will shift the game with that thing's death and set the preconditions for an overall victory. We then have a unit of Sacred Band. They're Sacred Band. If you played against them, you'll understand they're pretty cool. They have just a really nice general stat mix, good resolve, okay defense, good attacks, good. All of the numbers are basically good, and with movement 6, they're also reasonably quick. The main thing they do is they have their free additional spellcasting option. That's usually going to be used to cast Molon Lab. I have no idea how to pronounce that. Molon Labe? Absolutely not. Which heals a regiment 1 wound for every success. that can be cast either onto themselves or onto normally it's range self, but it can also be cast onto the Phalangides with the Sacred Band Auxiliary because of how the auxiliary rules work, which is just really good, basically. It's just a good self-contained unit. It punches on, it can sustain itself with healing, it can assist the Phalangides with healing. Healing is great to have, and this is really the only source of healing in city-states. Now, just in terms of overall appraisal of this list, it can be viewed from a high level as maybe a little bit eclectic. It's doing a lot of different things. There are no duplicate regiments, for example. I mean, technically there are the two chariots, but even the chariots are different things. I would like to suggest that this is actually a strength of the list. Now, I mentioned as we're talking through this that one of the things that Michael is really good at as a player is understanding the capabilities of his individual regiments and learning over time where those regiments should match up, where they should fight, where their greatest strengths are. One of the things that you won't necessarily always see in a conquest list is that wide variety of capabilities. And in fact, when you're just learning Conquest, and even when you're a relatively advanced Conquest player but you're approaching a new faction for the first time, redundancy is often going to serve you better. Just take whatever you think the most powerful thing is in multiples. Because, yeah, that probably actually just gives you the most overall power in a list. And one of the things about power is that it's powerful. Just take a list that has lots of good things, it will serve you well. But to make the step beyond that, you need to start thinking more specifically about capabilities in a list. What are all of the different things that you can do? How can you have a list that maybe changes one unit into a unit that is strong in a different way? And how can you leverage that strength that is different? And the chariots are kind of a perfect example of that, where the Scorpios is probably better than the Flogobolan. But is a second Scorpios better than a second Flogobolan if you are very good at using them and can take advantage of that difference? And it's that kind of looking for specific capabilities and having as wide a variety of capabilities as possible that we see in Michael's list construction. There is no duplicate units, everything is different, and every unit does different things. Even the giants all function in very different ways, and the giants themselves function in very different ways to the infantry. The list has an anvil, but just one. It has force concentration, but it's just in a couple of monsters. It has aggressively long threat range, but just on really one unit. It has good ranged, but just on two things. And so what it is trying to do is engineer game situations where it makes and executes a plan where each of those individual capabilities is used to achieve some kind of local superiority that the opponent can't match because they don't have that specific capability in that specific place, that then produces overall victory. That makes this a highly technical list. This isn't a list I mean, this is a list that basically anyone could pick up and play, but you would expect to have to practice it and learn how all of the different tools that the list has access to can interact with different game situations to achieve mastery. But it is a list that enables mastery, and that's super cool. It's not mastery in the same way, for example, that Tom's Dweghom list was. Tom's Dweghom list is a list that enables mastery of formation. Once you learn how to pack and build that Dweghom box formation and then unfold it when you need to, that is how you kind of achieve mastery over that Dweghom list. And that's how that Dweghom's list's strengths become really aggressively strong. This city-states list, you achieve mastery just by playing it an awful lot and developing a full understanding of how all of the different pieces can work to achieve those different and localized victories based on whatever one specific or two or three specific strengths you have that are most applicable to a situation. The more capabilities you have, the more likely you are to have one that is perfect for a given situation, state, or time, and that's how this list plays. And it is super cool, and I'm really excited for Michael to have made it all the way to second place. He made it all the way to top table, a very narrow and well-fought game against an exceptional player who we'll get to next. Michael, congratulations on second place. Very happy for you. This was an awesome list, and I'm really glad with how you did. Now, last, and by no means finally, we have Nords, piloted by Ewan from Western Australia, a very good friend of mine. And for this list, we're going to run through it, and we're going to talk about a few different things, actually, but one of the big ones is activation control, and how that can impact a game of Conquest, and how this list is very good at taking advantage of it. This is a wide list. It has a lot of characters, and a lot of regiments, and it arrives on the board aggressively but carefully. We'll get to that as we talk through it. And it is aiming to build situations where it always has the last one or two or three activations in a turn and can capitalize on those, and also to set up plays where, because it has the last couple of activations in a turn, Ewan will know who won the supremacy roll the turn that he's playing, and so he will know if he's advantaged in the coming turn, and will potentially play to set up plays that capitalize on the supremacy roll the next turn as well. And these are all enabled by activation advantage. This is not something that has always been the case in Conquest history. For a very long time, Conquest had a very intentional rubber banding mechanic built into it. It used to be that after you had each built your command stack, whoever had fewer cards in the command stack could modify their roll for supremacy, which would give them a chance of getting what they wanted, whether it would be to go second in a turn or go first in a turn. And what this meant is it did two things. The first thing was that it functioned kind of as a rubber band mechanic. If you had two players of approximately equal activation counts, and one of them lost a regiment early, well, that probably meant that they were behind. If you each took 11 activations, 11 regiments and characters into a game, and you've lost one, well, you're probably behind. But as some compensation, you will have a better chance. It's about a 67.5% chance to decide whether or not you were to go either first or second, depending on what you want. Usually in late game, that will be to go first, which helps rubber band you back into the game. The second thing it did was it provided a soft incentive against playing really, really wide lists. Now, speaking as a person who enjoys playing really, really wide lists in any game that you give me access to those things, I think it's really important that games include soft incentives against that kind of playstyle, because it tends to be really powerful. Just having tons and tons of dudes in any game is often a pretty good strategy, and in alternating activation games like Song of Ice and Fire and Conquest, it is particularly good. In fact, anyone in the audience who has played Song of Ice and Fire might be familiar with just how dominant a strategy activation advantage is in that game. And one of the things that differentiated Song of Ice and Fire from Conquest until recently was that Conquest included those soft incentives not to play that wide because you weren't guaranteed advantage. One of those soft incentives has been removed in the last year, which means that go hog wild, I guess. Play as wide as you'd like. Now, I believe the developers' reason for that was that there were certain factions they were introducing to the game, in particular Sorcerer Kings, that actually just by their nature kind of play wide. They have lots of cards in their command stack because of the rituals. And I think the developers didn't want the Sorcerer Kings to always be playing with a disadvantage on the initiative roll just because of how their faction was built. Now, for my money, I think you'd have been better off just having a little sub-rule in Sorcerer Kings that say don't count ritual cards in your command stack when you are determining who has the advantage on the supremacy roll, but instead the developers chose to remove a protection against a previously abusive strategy. And yeah, you can see some of the effect of that abusive strategy in play in a list like this. Now, it is worth noting that there are still strong protections in Conquest against that kind of play being dominant. There are a couple of really important ones that are in play. The first is just the way that characters are designed. Conquest is very specifically designed not to become a hero hammer game, and this means that characters really, you pay a premium for characters. Characters add 0 wounds to a regiment, and are often going to be not necessarily less impactful than an equal weight in additional stands would be, but there is a bit of a premium associated with characters, and they don't necessarily add resiliency to an army relative to their points cost. This means that very wide activation lists can still kind of be a little bit fragile because you're paying that premium on every one of those characters just to unlock the troop slots in your warbands to get all of those extra activations into a list. Secondly, and equally important, there is still a supremacy roll. One of the reasons why in Song of Ice and Fire activation count is so dominant is that you always know who's going first next turn. With like no, there's like one tiny exception that can, there's a thing that can, one mechanic that can change who's going first, but in practice you will always know who is going first next turn, which means that if in Song of Ice and Fire you are playing a list with a very wide activation count, you can, with absolute certainty, know if you'll be first next turn, which means you can use your activation advantage to have a unit activate late in the turn, knowing that you will 100% be able to set up a potentially devastating play by activating that unit and taking like a long movement with it so that it can do something like a devastating flank charge on the beginning of the next turn, and your opponent, with very few exceptions, can't stop you from doing that. They have to just play and deploy conservatively, accept the fact that that's something that you will have the option to do and adjust their own facing and play to accommodate. In Conquest, there is still a supremacy role. Even with if Ewan loses quote unquote the role on one turn, he is still only going to have that 33, 32 and a bit percent chance to, or 67% chance to win the role the next turn, which means that there is a 32% chance that he won't win that role the next turn. And if that risk materializes, then something terrible could happen. And so you still have to hedge your bets, right? You are not rewarded with a guaranteed play. You are rewarded with a high likelihood play. And from a strategic perspective, there's a big difference between those two things. There is a massive difference between a certainty and an about 2 in 3 chance of a good outcome. Now, with that said, activation advantage is still really, really good in Conquest, and Ewan's list is making full use of it, so let's jump into the list and talk through it as we go. So, the Warlord in this list, and I think this should probably be the Warlord in maybe not all, but a significant portion of Nord's list, is the Volya. Yes, I'm aware that's not how you pronounce it, but this is a YouTube video, so we're going to pronounce it that way so that I don't get demonetized. The Volya is the Warlord. She has no upgrades, but her Warlord ability is excellent, and particularly in this list, it gives, I believe, the entire army +1 evasion. And especially when you are dealing with things like raiders, going from defense 1 evasion 1 to defense 1 evasion 2 is a significant improvement in durability. Her supremacy ability also allows all spellcasters in the list, and there are 3 of those in this list, to target regiments on zones regardless of range, and that's just really, really nice in terms of force projection. She is a unit in a unit of 3 Huskarls, and then we can see Warband 2, which is just Warband 1 copy, which is a second Volya in a unit of 3 Huskarls. Now, when Ewan was testing this list, there's a real like close over under on Huskarls versus Valkyries. They are the exact same cost, and they're very close in terms of utility and power. In fact, I would say in terms of power, they're pretty close to identical. They are very well balanced units at 150 points for an MSU each. The choice you are basically making is between Untouchable and Impact attacks and Blessed. The Valkyries, I believe, also have Devout, but that doesn't matter in this particular case because the Volyas have Devout and will be adding it to the unit. Blessed versus Untouchable and Impacts is very, very close. The impacts in this case enable you to have a better chance of killing objectives because you can make your impact attacks. You'll usually get 3 hits, which is usually a quite good chance to do a wound to the objective. And then Untouchable, basically Untouchable works against range attacks, Blessed doesn't. You can also give these units Blessed just by a spell from the Volyas. And while Blessed is probably overall a more powerful rule, the kind of important case in this instance is that these are MSUs carrying around important spellcasters, which means that they're not really trying to get into close combat all that often. And because they're not trying to get into melee, choosing the defensive ability, Untouchable, that works against range attacks just makes more sense. If you had a larger block, perhaps with a Volya with some abilities or some artifacts that was going to buff up that unit's melee attack, or durability or something that was looking to get into close combat, then Blessed as an always on, not contingent on the Volya, not contingent on the Volya succeeding a spell, would make more sense. So in a bigger unit, you've also got support on the Valkyries. In a bigger unit, the Valkyries make more sense. As an MSU that is trying not to get into close combat a lot of the time, the Huskarls are the better choice. So 2 Volyas, each with a unit of Huskarls. As our third of 5 warbands, we then have a Vargo Lord with the Wild Beast Mastery. So the Vargo Lord is a very powerful character. He gives Flurry to all of the Half-Bloods, something like that, in his warband. In any case, those 3 Golter Beast Pack regiments, he's giving Flurry to all of those. Flurry is one of the most powerful rules you can just hand out on a stick in a game, and while we see there are plenty of warlords in the game that have some small incentive that they give to take certain unit types with them, a really good example is the Leonine Prideboard in Spires, who gives just a little ability that helps the Leonine Avatara and Centaur Avatara work together. You are not often going to trigger that ability, but it's a little signpost, it's a little thing that you might play towards and trigger. With the Varga Lord, No, bitch, you get Flurry. Flurry is awesome, and it is on all of those Golter Beast pack. He's also got the Wild Beast Mastery, which enables all of those Golter to ignore hindering terrain, and that is a really big deal. Finally, he has Forward Force just baked in, which is one of 2 flank regiments that we're going to have in this list. And I think the flank on the mediums is a very, very nice to have, particularly with a character in them. We'll talk about board development with this list in a little bit, but it's flank on another character that is probably a little bit more impactful. Anyway, the Varga Lord has 3 units of Golter Beast Pack. You could feasibly cut and chop and change to fit a 4th regiment, but I think we're probably hitting diminishing returns at that point. 3 Golter Beast Pack gives you just a really good chance of getting 1 or more of those regiments into a position where they're very dangerous, and Golter are very, very dangerous. They have good durability, not great, right? 5 wounds, defense 3, resolve 3 for 160 points is eminently serviceable from a durability perspective, but their offensive output is just really well rounded. They are good impact troops with brutal impact, impact 3, linebreaker, and good clash. They are good in melee thanks to flurry and linebreaker on a high attack volume plus leaders. And they have trample. And this means that the Golter are just a really well-rounded offensive unit. If you can charge Clash with them, you will mess your opponent up because you get all of the impacts, and then all of the attacks, and then all of the trample, which means, among other things, this is a regiment that can one-shot an objective. But even if you just march charge, you will still get the impacts and the trample, which is just low enough in terms of expected damage output to maybe not, for example, one-shot an MSU, but also it can, and it can absolutely do enough damage to set up an ensuing melee to go your way. And one of the things about Golter Beast Pack offensive output is that with Flurry and Clash 3, if you need to make an uninspired clash, it's still very likely to do damage, which can easily finish off a regiment that you wounded the turn before, which can then set up a charge, which you can then deal the impact attacks and then trample to your charge target. And if that sounds like the kind of play that could be really, really powerful as a bottom of one turn, start of the next turn play, perhaps you're beginning to see what the activation advantage this list has starts letting it do. The Golter are a key element in that threat, being very good at activating late and being very good at activating early, depending on the game state. The 4th Warband is led by a Jarl. He has no special upgrades, but he has his native forward force ability, which lets him go in a unit of Berserks with a Savage. He then has a unit of Raiders with a Captain as the mainstay in his regiment, in his Warband. Now, it's easiest to talk about him in context with Warband 5 as well, which includes a Shaman in a unit of Raiders with a Captain and a unit of Berserks with a Savage. Now, this is where we start looking at like board development and how board development can play out. But first, let's just talk about Berserks. They're very good. This list is always going to deliver both of them onto the table on the 3rd turn guaranteed, because you will auto on one of them with your automatic arrival, and you'll auto on the other with forward force granting flank from the Jarl. These units get to move a long way onto the table on the turn they arrive, thanks to a combination of Movement 6, Standard Bearer, and Vanguard, which lets them move, I want to say, 17 inches up on the first turn, on the turn they arrive. And from there, they project a tremendously long-range threat. And if I was going to describe one of the things that exemplifies Ewan as a player, it is really, really long threat ranges. You find, like, in the same way that if you can find a way to put recursion and activation advantage into a list, I will find that. Ewan, its activation advantage and long threat ranges. The Savage gives the Berserks access to a free charge every turn, which means they can, for example, march, charge, clash. And the distances that they project as a result of that are very, very long. Your threat range is 12 plus rerollable d6, plus a clash. And we spoke about how a 12-inch threat on Giants, thanks to Arista, was quite long and hard to play around. Well, our rerollable 2+ giving you a 14-inch melee threat is also really long. And the Berserks are very, very dangerous on top of that. 5 attacks each with Cleave 2 and Clash 3 means that the damage output of these regiments, it might be less, for example, than an Ironclad Drake, but not by a lot, and that makes this a very, very dangerous regiment with a very long threat range. They're also surprisingly durable for a 4-wound regiment, because the Volya, as a reminder, is giving everything +1 evasion, which means that these regiments have Evasion 2, Tenacious, Resolve 4, which means that they're actually surprisingly difficult to put down, particularly when you add in all of the healing that the 2 Volyas can do. Now, The Shaman is kind of present here as a very small 11th hour optimization. Original versions of this list had one less character. The second unit of Raiders and second unit of Berserks just rolled into the Jarl's regiments, and those extra points were used for things like additional stands, etc. But in late tinkering with this list, basically one of the things that was put forward in testing between Ewan and myself was that if we cut this and this and this, we can slam a Shaman in there. Now, Shamans are not fantastic, but they're also not expensive. 80 points is the cheapest activation in Nords. And for those 80 points, you get an activation and some spells, including Hoarfrost, which is a serviceable offensive spell, and just the occasional other thing. Blurred Vision, for example, can be a fun spell to cast. If you're having to fight your way through scaling, it's only got a 50% success chance, but you can really mess with an opponent with Blurred Vision. For example, things like Dweghom sorcerers on Ironclads, pulling their range down from 16 to 12. You can actually do that from outside of the resultant threat range because the threat range on Blurred Vision is so long. Now, frankly, I would note that Dweghom shooting and spellcasting into this list is a bit miserable to use in any case, because Dweghom shooting relies on high armor piercing values, and this whole list is just evasion and tenacious out the arse. But in practice, I'm told that the Shaman performed quite well. Now, the other thing the Shaman does is help with controlling how board development works. It would be a mistake to assume that this list rushes onto the field. Like, yes, ostensibly it does. Most of the time, this list is entirely present by turn 3. Sometimes there might be, say, for example, a Golter unit arriving late, but frankly, that's not particularly likely. However, it does not just bomb all of those units onto the field as soon as it possibly can early in the turn. All of those characters means that you have considerable stall in your list on the turns even that units are arriving. And so it's going to be very likely to see this list develop, like say on turn 2, where your opponent has, a couple of regiments, maybe with a character that are arriving, maybe they've got a couple of lights on the field already, maybe it's a Wardrun list and they have multiple lights on the field already and some mediums arriving this turn. But your activations are Volya, pass back to you, Volya, pass back to you, Shaman, pass back to you, Jarl, pass back to you, Vagra Lord, pass back to you. Well, not the Jarl, that would be on turn 3, but turn 2, yeah, Vagra Lord, pass back to you. You are 4 activations deep before you have to commit anything. That's just characters going. And even a Wardrun list that is bombing lights onto the field is going to have to start committing things by that point. Then you can just move the Raiders around a little bit if need be, don't expose them. Then you can move a non-committal Huskarl unit onto a position where it's going to be contesting a zone. And so the idea is that yes, you have activation advantage, but part of how that activation advantage materializes is that with all of these characters, right, 5 characters, almost always 4 of which will be available to you to pad out your command stack on turn 2, you get to see your opponent commit a lot of where their resources are going to be in that pivotal turn 2, and then again on turn 3 development. And so, as both players are developing their boards, moving pieces onto the field, setting their regiments up, the Nord player is going to have the ability to position responsively. They will be able to identify weaknesses in their opponent's deployment and move their own units to maximize their units' strengths and do things like, for example, line those Golter up into things the Golter are good against. Linebreaker can be a situational ability. Your opponent is not always going to have that many things with shields and bastion, but if you can guarantee that the Golter are going to line up into the things that they have shields and bastion, then the Golter go from being good to fantastic. And so this calm, slow rollout where, yes, you're going to be on the board in force early in the game, but you're going to do so in a way that actually maximizes how the list gets to counter deploy its opponent, then plays into the second thing the list wants to do, which is wait for a turn where it is going to have the initiative advantage next turn and position aggressively to capitalize on that. You're looking for late in turn march charge clashes with Berserks or march charges with Golter that then set, or even just positioning with those units that set up aggressive turns early in the next turn. Now, sometimes the risk will materialize, but the fact of the matter is that this list has got 14 activations. And that means it's usually going to have something like 2 activations or maybe even 3 activations after its opponents in many cases, which means the absolute worst case scenario is that you position 2 Golter units, each to deal devastating charges on the next turn, or 2 Berserk units, each to deal devastating charges on the next turn, and then your opponent can only possibly respond to one of those. And so we have in one list lots of damage, lots of ability to heal through early game chip, right? Like, Raiders are not the most durable regiments in the game, but they are surprisingly durable with Evasion 2 and Tenacious, and so any chip damage that comes into them can be healed by the Volus when they arrive. This keeps the list's strength up, and it keeps its activation count up into the mid game and therefore into the late game, and allows it to play clinically and precise and dangerously, which maybe isn't in Nord theme, but is just one of the strongest ways to play Conquest. Now, I don't think this list is broken, right? I think it is very strong. I think it's one of the strongest lists that showcases how changes in game design can produce outcomes that maybe the game developers didn't 100% predict, but this list is absolutely beatable. However, in the hands of one of the best players in the world, and certainly one of the best players in Australia, Ewan has, for example, represented Australia at HEOS. It was absolutely good enough to get to first place at CanCon. It played against Michael in the final round. That was the Seed States list that we just just saw, and it took first place overall. So huge congratulations, Ewan, for firstly a very well-deserved victory, and secondly, just creating a fantastic list. Great list name as well, and overall just a really good showcase in how activation advantage, all of the different ways that activation advantage can be taken advantage of in a game like Conquest, and what careful deployment and use of resources and capitalization on strengths looks like at its highest level in a game like this. So, big congratulations to all 3 of the players that we've looked at today: Tom's Dweghom, Michael's City States, and Ewan's Nords. And big thanks to you, the viewer, for watching. Hope very much that you've enjoyed this. If you have any questions, please do feel free to put them in the comments section below. I don't do Conquest content all that often, but when I do, I enjoy it. Conquest is one of my 2 favorite games alongside Infinity, and it's great to sit down and really just do a deep dive into some of the concepts that you can encounter in this game, and maybe that's of interest to you. I have done a video previously, for example, about why Infinity players might enjoy Conquest and vice versa, how the 2 games complement each other, so go and have a look at that if it's something that you haven't seen before. Otherwise, just as a quick plug, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below for single-time donations, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. If you have Conquest topics that you'd be interested in having discussed on this channel, I'm super open to suggestions. And although Conquest is a game that's a little bit difficult to do good battle reports for because it's a 10-turn game, I think it is a game that's very open to things like more deep dive content like this. I know there are more events coming up. In fact, Australia has an absolute ton of events being held along the East Coast over the next few months that I'm hoping to attend at least some of. Maybe there will be some battle reports or event reports from those, but if not, always happy to have suggestions as to what kind of conquest content the audience would like to see. As always, big thanks to you again for watching. Hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.